Alright, hey guys, so today I wanted to do something a little different. Some of you guys have probably noticed these Holga lenses for your DSLR online. I forget how much they are, about 20 bucks or so. I'll put the price up here. But anyway, maybe you had an idea of whether or not you wanted to give it a shot or not, see if it was worth it. Uh, I did that. I decided it would be something fun to mess around with, play with, and I just wanted to see what kind of results you'd get from it. I grew up in the early film era, and I saw the advent of the early digital cameras as well. And so I remember, quite a range of quality options in my photographic past. So I wanted to start by mentioning that these lenses come set at f8, which is going to make it really hard to see if you're trying to use an optical viewfinder. You might have better luck using live view or on a mirrorless camera using an electronic viewfinder, for example, because it's just very, very dark. And that makes it really hard to compose, but it makes it really hard to focus. And so that's one thing you're going to notice with these lenses is that the focusing is very difficult. They're not particularly precise either. And so, yeah, have a little bit of fun trying to get perfect focus with these. It takes a lot of work. You'll have a lot of missed shots. But that's part of where I find the appeal in these lenses is that you get some really interesting out of focus effects with it, and tend to come up with a fairly dreamy quality to your images. Now on the focusing itself, it does really, it only kind of gives you a visual representation, as you can see in this photo here, of what to expect to be in focus. Now, I've never shot with a Holga particularly before, but I have shot with a lot of, pretty bad old digital cameras that had a very narrow aperture setting available. And so basically the same thing happens here. Generally, you have to shoot in very bright daylight, uh, in, or you're going to end up basically raising your ISO like crazy, getting a lot of ISO noise, and or slower shutter speeds that are going to blur motion. It's very easy to find instructions online, but there are a couple ways to modify the lens. One of them is to take the vignette plate out, which gets rid of a lot of the vignetting you see in the image, uh, and or to make the aperture larger. There's a plate that actually physically they put in there to make the aperture smaller. And so I'm not sure if the numbers are accurate. The lens claims to be f8, but after doing the modification, it may be somewhere in the neighborhood of f5. Pretty early on, I realized it was just impractical to shoot with the really narrow aperture. So I did do the modification, and so that made the lens a little easier to use. It's a little brighter, easier to see through, easier to focus, and the vignetting, I figure, I can always add the vignetting after the fact in post if I want to. So I just didn't really feel the need to keep that. So actually, I found that it was easier to kind of play with it and dial it in manually myself, using a little bit of exposure compensation, or when you're in the non-CPU lens menu, which you'll need to use to program the lens, you can just change the specified maximum aperture setting, and that will actually trick the camera's computer as well. So I didn't use this lens a whole lot, and so I didn't have a lot of examples to use, so I just took a couple extra shots of my daughter around the house. I should have been taking more shots outside in bright daylight, but being on quarantine, I didn't have that option. But I did take a few, and I think I have enough information to kind of give you an idea about the lens, what you could do with it, what to expect. Now, as a lens that's intended for that type of photography, I will say that it actually can take decent quality photos. Um, Not on par with your best lenses or anything like that, but the quality is fairly good, surprisingly so, when you actually get it in perfect focus, you know. One thing I will say is that, and this is partially my belief, is that I believe that film renders, especially out of focus parts of an image, much differently than digital does. And I will say that you won't get the same result from this as you would a real Holga camera, just in my opinion. Um, you know, not only, of course, a Holga is a square format, but I just feel like the digital sensor reads differently, and so just throwing a plastic lens on a digital camera is different. However, it is a fun option to play with and something fun to do. You know, a real Holga camera plus some film and development doesn't cost a whole lot either. And so you may have better results with that. Plus, you're going to get a very large negative out of it. 120 film is pretty large, and so the quality could be a lot higher unless you're shooting with like a really high megapixel camera like a D800, for example. One more thing to also look out for is that if you're using this lens on a crop sensor camera, the lens is going to be very narrow field of view. So, you know, it's a 60 millimeter lens on full frame, but it's going to be around a 90 on crop. Now, I'm currently shooting this video on the lens, and it's in a crop sensor camera. And so this lens should be displaying about a 90 millimeter focal length right here. So just for your own reference, this is kind of the style and view that you might look for. I will say that it's nighttime, and I have no real lighting for video or anything like that, any kind of studio lighting. So this is just some cheap fluorescent bulbs. So the lighting's going to be bad no matter what. And I didn't even bother adding a microphone because, well, Lomography, I guess. This lens is something fun to just play with and shoot with. If you're trying to get high quality images, it's not the one you're going to want to reach for. Sometimes you're going to regret a photo that would have been a good photo on a good lens. You may turn to regret having put this lens on your camera for that. That said, I think you'll have a good time playing around with it, and with a little bit of post-processing, you may be able to get some images that are fairly reminiscent of, you know, true toy camera style images, and it just gives you something fun to do and play around with. I mean, for me, for example, you know, I've grown to love the look of digital over the years, and the crispness and cleanness and stuff. But at the same time, sometimes I, you know, yearn back for some of the lo-fi qualities of film, or not film necessarily, but I mean, I grew up shooting on, you know, little 110 film cameras, for example. And so those images were pretty terrible. And then some of the early digital cameras were like 2-3 megapixels at most, and they were terrible looking. So I kind of have a soft spot in my heart for bad photography, but I also shoot towards, you know, really good photography on the opposite end of the spectrum. So this just gives me something fun to do and play around with. All right, guys, hope this answers some of your questions, and take care. Enjoy.